Salvete discipuli discipulaeque. Today I'd like to talk about the accusative forms. Before we start our lesson, there are a few things that we have to remember though. Direct objects are in the accusative case. So a direct object is what a verb is happening to. So if I kick the ball, then the ball is the direct object. And the direct object has to be in the accusative case. Adjectives have to match the case of their noun. So if the ball is red, then the ball has to have an ending that shows that it goes with an accusative noun. So watch the video on lesson 6 for more information about that. And finally, each declension has two accusative forms, one for singulars and one for plurals. And they aren't the same, and both have to be memorized for each declension. These are the endings that we should be really comfortable with. For the first declension, a, I, a, I, is, os, is. For the second declension, us, I, o, o, I, is, os, is. And the third declension is one that we haven't seen very much of. Indeed, this is the first time that we really start caring about it. The nominative singular varies hugely from word to word. For example, Felix, the name Felix, ends with an X, but arbor, for tree, ends with an R. So there's no big pattern for the singular nominative for the third declension, so we just leave it blank. And the pattern I use to remember the third declension is blank is, I, eme, ace, ibus, ace, ibus, 3. So again, that's blank is, I, eme, ace, ibus, ace, ibus, 3. See how that works? So the endings that we really care about for now are the nominative and the accusative endings. Those are the ones that we're going to be using the most, and especially in this lesson. These are all of the third declension nouns we've met so far in Ecce Romani, and they're listed in nominative singular first, genitive singular next, then their gender, and then their meaning. And already you can kind of see what I was talking about before, where the nominative singular doesn't really have a pattern in the third declension. There's no one ending for the nominative singular third declension noun. So you can see arbor, fragor, clamor, all of those end with or, but walks ends with an X, and aistos looks like a first declension accusative plural ending. And that's fine. The nominative singular for the third declension doesn't have a pattern, so it can be anything it wants to be, but it's specific to each noun. So we just have to memorize what its nominative singular form is. As we're talking about accusatives and direct objects, it's important to note that not all verbs need direct objects. And some verbs sometimes need direct objects and sometimes don't. So here are some verbs that don't need direct objects. Sedet, meaning sit. So Cornelia sits is a perfectly good sentence. It doesn't need a direct object. And indeed, it doesn't really make sense for there to be a direct object. You can't really sit something. I guess we might be able to in English with some sort of colloquialism, but in Latin, I haven't experienced that yet. Cornelia et Flavia ambulant. That's another one. Ambulant is just walks. So Cornelia and Flavia walk is a perfectly fine sentence that doesn't need a direct object. Cornelia is tired. Cornelia defessa est. Defessa is just an adjective, and so est is describing that Cornelia is that. So once again, est doesn't need a direct object either. Here we have a sentence. Servus clamorem audit. Now let's pay attention to the endings here. Us, and t. So that audit tells us that it's a singular event. There's only one subject to this verb. And servus, if we look at our paradigm, tells us that it's a nominative singular second declension noun. And so we know that servus is the subject because it's the nominative. Clamorem, that's our new accusative singular third declension ending. The slave hears the noise. Let's look at the sentence, servi clamorem audiunt. Looking at the endings, that unt ending means that we now have to have a plural subject. If we take servi to be a nominative plural of servus, then that makes the sentence work. The slaves hear the noise. But consider for a second the other possible ending for servi, genitive singular. That means something of the slave hears the noise. If previously there had been a mention of the slave's ears, then we might assume that the ears are the subject of the sentence. The ears of the slave hear the noise. So you have to look at context a little bit to see what's really going on in the sentence. If there was a noun from previously in the paragraph, you might be able to resupply it in a sentence to have another potential meaning. But here, in isolation, I would think that the thing that makes the most sense would be that servi is nominative plural, and that's the subject of audient. Slaves hear the noise. Now let's consider this next sentence. Servi clamores audiunt. We still have that unt ending, so we still need a plural subject. And if we look at this new ending for clamor, we see clamores could be either nominative plural or accusative plural. So we have another candidate to be the subject of audient. If clamores is the subject, then what's servi doing? And if servi is the subject, what's clamores doing? So let's assume that clamores is the subject here. Barring that it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for the noises to hear anything, what would servi be doing? Well, servi is genitive, so we could do some sort of flowery language to say the noises hear those things of the slave. It's a possibility, I guess, but let's consider what happens if servi is the subject. Servi can be either genitive singular or nominative plural, and if it's nominative plural, it can be the subject of audient. If it is the subject of audient, then clamores has to be the direct object. The slaves hear the noises. I think that sits a little bit better. Now, remember that servi is genitive singular, so it could be that they're possessing the subject. But once again, I think that's a little bit of a stretch for the sentence in isolation, though it is possible in context. We have arrived at our penultimate sentence. Marcus et Cornelia et Sextus spectant. If we look at the endings for this sentence, we see that spectant has an nt ending that tells us that we need to have a plural subject here. However, if we look at the rest of the sentence, we see that all of the other nouns end in a nominative singular ending. But we can take all three of those, since they're combined with et, as the group subject for this sentence. So those three together form a plural, and so they are the subjects for spectant. So the sentence is, Marcus and Cornelia and Sextus watch. We don't need to know what they're watching. It makes the sentence a little awkward, sure, but it's enough for the sentence to exist to have them just watch. Let's compare that with this sentence. Multos servos laborantes spectant. Once again, we have that nt ending, so we need a plural subject. If we look over at a noun, we recognize servos as a noun, and so let's look at its ending. It's accusative plural. And if we look at multos, we know that that comes from multus many. And it's a 2-1-2 adjective, so when it's describing a masculine noun, it has to follow the second declension. Servus is a masculine noun, so it's possible that multos is going with servos. If we look at the case ending, then we see that multos matches in gender, number, and case with servos. Now it's very, very likely that multos goes with servos. Next, we have a new adjective, laborantes. That means working. It has to match in gender, number, and case with its noun as well. It's an adjective, but we haven't seen these third declension adjectives yet. We'll get to them in the future, but for right now, just know that they're like 2-1-2 adjectives, except that instead of following the second, first, and second declension based on what gender they modify, they follow the third declension. If we look at that ending, es with the macron over the e, once again that could be either nominative or accusative plural. Since it's an adjective, it's probably modifying a noun, and if it's modifying a noun, then we have to find an accusative or nominative plural noun for it to modify. Now, we have a noun, servos, that's accusative plural, and laborantes can modify it. So, the sentence could be, they, whoever they are, watch the many slaves working. That seems to make a lot of sense, but that means that we have to include a they from elsewhere. Let's suppose it's Marcus, Cornelia, and Sextus. Marcus, Cornelia, and Sextus watch. They watch the many slaves working. That's a perfectly good way to translate that sentence. However, adjectives can be substantive, meaning that laborantes could be the workers. Those working, the workers. So it could be laborantes spectant, the workers watch the many slaves. It's important to consider the possibilities for laborantes. Laborantes could go with the many slaves. They watch the many slaves working. It could go with the assumed subject. The workers watch the many slaves. And it could be that it goes with Marcus, Cornelius, and Sextus. Marcus and Cornelius and Sextus watch. They, working, watch the many slaves. We've arrived at the end of our lesson today. Here are some things I'd really like you to take away from this. Word endings create meaning, not word order. So any preconception we have of subject verbing the direct object in English doesn't apply to Latin. We have to look to the endings of our words in order to figure out what the word's doing in that sentence. Alright, next, the third declension exists now. We have to be really careful about our endings. We have to memorize a new set, blank is, ieme, ace, ibis, ace, ibis 3, and we have to be able to apply those endings to the new nouns we're going to learn that are in the third declension. Next, when we're translating, we have to consider all options. We saw before that laborantes could take a bunch of different forms, could modify a bunch of different things. And so it's up to us as translators to figure out which one we think makes the most sense. And finally, context is key. If we want to figure out what a word means, we have to look to elsewhere in the paragraph, see what fits best. And then that's our translation. So you can kind of see how translation is becoming more and more creative. We get to look at a word, see what it could do, and then pick whichever one we like best. Alright, that's it for the lesson. Walete!